This video is part 2 of Chapter 9, Single Case Research Designs for PSY 222, Research Methods in the Psychological Sciences. In this part of the chapter, we're going to talk about ABAB designs. As the name implies, what you're doing is applying or measuring a baseline, applying a treatment, going back to baseline, applying the treatment again. It's a powerful technique for demonstrating the impact of an intervention on specific behaviors with individuals. Excuse me. The name ABAB, A refers to the baseline, B refers to the treatment conditions, and what you're doing statistically is contrasting the two. What the goal typically of ABAB designs is to document that you can show a behavior change that is systematically in response to the application of an intervention or a treatment. For example, if you are using rewards to encourage vocal speech in a child that's nonverbal, you would establish a baseline of vocalizations without the application of the rewards, then add the rewards, measure the vocalizations, remove the rewards, measure the vocalizations, add the rewards back in, and then you would be able to make the comparisons. So the initial stage, the initial A of an ABAB design would be a baseline. That's followed by a treatment stage at B, next a return to baseline, and then another treatment phase. Since the treatment is being systematically applied and then removed, any kind of change in behavior is going to be evident when you plot out the behavior. This image shows, what you would see if you had, over the course of several days, you're plotting behaviors. So you start at baseline, this would be A, and then you apply the treatment. So let's say you have a high frequency of behaviors that you would like to go away, and then you have a treatment and you apply the treatment, the behaviors drop in frequency, you remove the treatment, the frequency of the behavior goes back up, you apply the treatment again, and the behavior that you desire to get rid of decreases. Here's another visual example, and this one comes from your textbook. And in this case, they were attempting to change a behavior, a disruptive eating behavior, where a child is banging a spoon. So you're documenting at baseline how many movements per minute, so how many of these repetitive spoon banging behaviors where you're seeing at baseline. Then the treatment, facial screening, is applied, and you measure, and you can see after some up and down, but still lower than what was present at baseline, you see a very dramatic decline in the behavior. Then there's a return to baseline where the treatment, the facial screening treatment is removed, and you see the behavior gradually increase again. Then you reapply the facial screening, and you see the behavior go down. Now, what a behavior therapist would do is then come back some months later and do a follow-up to examine how well the intervention is persisting and whether the behavior has in fact been extinguished. Now, and there are versions of an ABAB design where you aren't doing reversals, and here what you're looking at, you look at the frequency of behaviors, but you're not going to see a reversal after the attempt to return to baseline. So if the pattern that you plot out in your graph doesn't show that characteristic return of a behavior that you applied a treatment to, that makes it hard for you to determine whether the behavior just naturally disappeared or whether the treatment itself was effective. So that's a difficulty that you might have in interpretation of the results using an A-B design when you don't see that predicted pattern. It could be that the change that you've made was an effect of learning, where perhaps the participant has acquired knowledge, and once that knowledge or that change has been demonstrated once, it's relatively stable and permanent, even when the treatment that was applied is removed. So even there, it's difficult to determine, was it really the treatment, or was it something that the child or the individual learned that was coincidental to the treatment. So that's an interpretation issue. There are some other methodological challenges with A-B designs. Researchers should be aware that they shouldn't be using an A-B design if the behavior that they're attempting to change isn't likely to go back to baseline after the treatment is removed. This would be the kinds of behaviors, like, let's say that you're doing speech language therapy with a nonverbal child, and you have used systematic application of rewards to encourage vocalization. I was talking with one of my former students who's now a behavior therapist, and she said sometimes once kids start to vocalize who've been nonverbal and they start to use speech sounds and words, it's like the genie's out of the bottle, and sometimes they rapidly start to increase their speech. Not every time, but let's say, just for the sake of example, that once a skill like that starts to be acquired, even when you remove the reward system, it may not revert back to baseline. So if that's the case, if you think the target behavior won't revert back to baseline, then an A-B design is not useful, and some other design ought to be used. Another reason for behaviors not returning to baseline might be that there's some other variable in the situation that has led to behavior change. For example, if you're doing therapeutic interventions with children, children grow and change rapidly. So it's entirely possible that there was a simultaneous developmental change that led to what you were seeing in terms of transformation of behavior. There could also be, if you're trying to change problem disruptive behaviors, for example, there could be changes in what's going on with the child in other environments that impacts their baseline level of the behavior itself. So those are some other challenges methodologically in terms of trying to control other variables that may have an impact on the target behavior of interest. It's also possible that initial changes that appear to be due to a treatment could have been due to the treatment itself, but it's possible that other kinds of changes, other kinds of variables rather, may start to become more influential as time goes by. So that could be other skills that the person has learned. It could be other habits that the person has acquired over time, and they could kind of take the place of the treatment in terms of influencing that particular behavior. So, for example, you could have you could be a behavior therapist, and you're working with a child again to develop speech language skills, and you've applied a specific treatment to increase the utilization of naming words, for example, and your treatment appears to be successful. Simultaneously, maybe the parents are working with the therapist to learn some additional skills for at home for working with their child when they're doing reading activities with their child. So it may be that those take longer to have an impact, but they also may have an impact on speech language production. So you may have other competing forces that come into play that can help you explain a relatively permanent change in behavior. If behaviors don't revert back to baseline at the B stage, then what researchers are really facing is the inability to really conclusively determine whether or not the initial treatment was responsible for the change. So they may have to use other methodologies to help them tease that out. Because you would need to determine, was it learning that was caused by the treatment? Was it learning caused by other variables that were not under control in the situation? So that would call for different methodologies. Now there are some ethical issues with ABAB designs, particularly when you're using them with vulnerable populations such as children. So if you're testing the effectiveness of a treatment that is designed to improve someone's behavior or alleviate painful symptoms or problematic symptoms that a person has, then you are removing that treatment and expecting that their behavior will revert to that worse state. That raises an ethical question of whether it's appropriate for you to return a person to a state of suffering or a state in which they could at least possibly harm themselves. So let's say, for example, that you're doing an ABAB design, testing a treatment intervention for self-harming behaviors in a child with autism spectrum disorder. You find that after the treatment is applied post-baseline, that in fact the child is exhibiting less self-injury behaviors. Now, is it ethical to remove a treatment that now has gotten a child, for example, to stop banging their head on the wall or the table, or to stop hitting themselves in the head, or to stop biting themselves? So you see the ethical quandary there. It raises the question, should I, if I am the researcher, for the sake of being able to use this powerful technique to show cause and effect, should I cause suffering to my participant in order to do that? So basically the ethical question is it ethical to remove what's benefiting my subject? Ultimately the question becomes, is it justifiable for me to harm another human being for the sake of proving cause and effect or supporting a causal argument about my variables of interest? So withdrawing beneficial treatments, it may not be something that you can ethically justify all the time. So the example that I gave you of self-injury behavior, in some cases, self-injury behavior can be devastating, and it would behoove you as the behavior therapist or as the researcher to say it would be inappropriate for me to remove this treatment because this child could injure themselves permanently, or they could end up maiming themselves, for example. Another example would be, in medical research, there may be a treatment that is so beneficial that it alleviates suffering, and the ethical quandary would be, removing it to show that the person then resumes having very negative symptoms. Is that ethical or appropriate? Some behaviors, since they might be life-threatening or they could have the high potential to disable the person or to permanently render them, say, scarred, for example, in that situation it would be unethical to remove the treatment when you see that it has positive impacts for the person. Now these would be these types of ethical issues, you would build in a protocol in the research design if you were going to use an ABAB design, and you were foreseeing that it was possible that this kind of positive impact could occur. You would have to think through the steps that you would take if that were to occur, such that you are not causing additional suffering to people unduly. And that concludes part 2 of Chapter 9, Single Case Research Design.